welcome to another Tweedy Pubs video. Sam Smith's, Yorkshire's oldest brewer, operates over 200 pubs across the country, and by my count 36 of them are located here in Greater London. Now, like any pub chain, it has its fans and it has its detractors. Personally, I've always been a fan of the Sam Smith's pubs because they have, some of them, wonderful, well-preserved historic interiors, and they maintain an atmosphere of pubs of an earlier bygone era, no pipe music, and a beer lineup that is entirely unsullied by grapefruit. Now, of course, it would be impractical to try and visit all 36 of those in the space of a single video. So what I've tried to do is pick out a handful of what I think are probably the best. This list is of course going to be contentious, and I'm sure you'll let me know in the comments which ones you think I should have included rather than the 5 I've picked here. It's partly designed to be a convenient walking tour as well. I've relied heavily, as always, on camera, the Campaign for Real Ales online pub guide. They also have their wonderful list of historic pub interiors. Of those 36 Sam Smith's pubs in Greater London, 7 of them make it on to the list for their historic interiors. Within those 7 they have different ratings from 1 to 3 stars. So my choice of the top 5 is going to be heavily biased by that. And I think the 3 of those pubs that get that maximal 3-star rating definitely are going to be featuring in my top 5. So the first on the list on today's itinerary, no surprises here, very famous pub, the Old Cheshire Cheese. Whether or not I would actually put this on my absolute top spot of that top 5 we'll get on to later, but it's the first on the list that we're visiting today. Cheers from the Old Cheshire Cheese. This is clearly not a very original choice for any kind of best pub in London list. It's one of London's most famous pubs, and it's also very much on the tourist trail, but I think catch this at the right moment and it can still be absolutely magical. Although we have a number of pub buildings here in London that date to the 18th century or even earlier, we have very few pub interiors that predate the Victorian era. Those Victorians were actually pretty ruthless at ripping out whatever came before and replacing it with fixtures and fittings of their own time. That for me is what makes the Cheshire Cheese so special. It's a listed building, of course, and Historic England believe that it was probably built in the latter half of the 17th century, which likely supports the claim on the sign that it was rebuilt in 1667, just after the Great Fire of London. It's another pub with the highest 3-star rating on CAMRA's list of historic pub interiors, and they postulate that some elements of it may actually date back to that 17th century rebuild. Again, that's practically unheard of here in London. Chiefly what they're talking about is the panelling in the small bar room to the right hand side as you enter. It may possibly also include some elements of the fixed bench seating in that room, possibly even the fireplace. If those fixtures and fittings are not from the 17th century, they're almost certainly 18th century, and that would already make it significantly older than the vast majority of pub interiors here in London. That small bar room for me is absolutely the most atmospheric space inside the pub, the one that I always aim for whenever it's available. Even though most of the literary associations with the pub, Samuel Johnson, Charles Dickens, tend to be more connected with the chop room across the hallway, if you can get here when it's quiet, perhaps on the dot of midday when it opens, and have a corner of it to yourself for a short while, there's something really spellbinding about this place. Ideally in winter when the fire is lit, to think that you could have sat here 350 years ago in the time of Samuel Pepys with a tankard of ale, and this space would have been more or less recognisable. I think that's incredible. I've covered the history and all those literary associations of the Cheshire Cheese in an earlier video on Fleet Street pubs. I'll put a link to that down in the description. I'm having a pint of Sam Smith's Old Brewery Bitter here. I have a feeling, given this pub's obvious tourist draw, the prices tend to be a bit higher here than some of the other Sam Smith's pubs in London. I'll put that price on screen. Pub number 2 on today's itinerary, but you know what? I actually think this is my favourite Sam Smith's pub in London of all, the Cittie of Yorke. Cheers from the Cittie of Yorke. as probably already mentioned, 3 of Sam Smith's pubs in London get that maximal 3-star rating from CAMRA for their historic pub interiors. It's interesting that those 3 different Sam Smith's pubs with that 3-star rating span 3 very different eras. We have those elements in the Cheshire cheese of possibly Georgian, possibly even late 17th century interior. The Princess Louise, which we'll see later, has a late Victorian interior. Here at the City of York, what we have is this beautiful mock Tudor interior that actually dates to the interwar period. It's from the 1920s. Although there has been a pub on this site for much longer, some sources claim 1430 even, the current building dates to 1924, as does the majority of the interior, but I believe it's been largely unchanged since then, for about 100 years. Looking at the outside quickly first, we're used to mock Tudor manifesting itself on pub exteriors with timber framing and jettied gables and all that, but this is a stone frontage. Portland stone, in fact. However, I suppose this pair of double height oriel windows has Tudor arches. They're wide and flat, sometimes described as a blunted Gothic arch. Note also those 2 letter H's in the cartouches up in the gables there. We'll get onto that later. Of course, the real mock Tudor splendour of this pub lies inside. There are in fact 3 different bar rooms, including a front bar room and a cellar bar, both of which I tend to completely ignore whenever I come to this pub and head straight for the magnificent back bar. This has been described as a medieval great hall, and I suppose it borrows from ecclesiastical architecture in a way. The high vaulted ceiling and what historic England describe as clerestory windows beneath them, a word that I want to pronounce as clerestory, something you'd more commonly see in a cathedral. Here, of course, it's a practical solution to getting some natural light in, and there are more of those Tudor arches in those windows. Given the location, the most likely inspiration for this is Gray's Inn Hall. The pub sits next to one of the gateways to the Gray's Inn complex, and several of the Inns of Court have grand old halls reminiscent of the dining rooms of Oxbridge and or Hogwarts. The stained glass here at one end of the hall must be modern, as I assume those initials SS are for Sam Smith's. A selection of casks, barrels and vats are arrayed above the bar counter. I think the larger of those are in fact sherry vats. Quite possibly they've been there since the 1920s rebuild, and they're likely a tip of the hat to Hennike's, the wine and spirit merchant that previously owned the premises. We'll come back to them in a bit. Another notable feature of this bar room is the run of booths or compartments, slightly reminiscent of the seating on one of those old slam door train carriages. We're used to seeing 1 or 2 snugs like this in London pubs, but to have 7 in a row on one wall and a further 2 or 3 on another wall is quite unusual. There is a long and quite low bar counter on the other side of the room, sometimes cited as the longest bar in London, although I think I recall a Wetherspoons pub contesting that at some point. Possibly one of the oldest things in this otherwise predominantly 1920s mock Tudor space is a triangular stove. It has a date of 1815 on it and was supposedly moved here from Gray's Inn. The City of York is a relatively recent name for this pub and only goes back to the time when Sam Smith's took it on, which I think was in the early 1980s, and it's of course a reference to the brewery's Yorkshire origins. The earliest newspaper reference I could find of it as the City of York is in 1984. Prior to that, it was part of, and indeed the one-time headquarters of, one of Britain's earliest chains of pubs and or possibly wine bars called Hennike's, and it has roots here going all the way back to the 1830s. There's a great article on the Boak and Bailey blog about the history of Hennike's. I'll put a link to that in the description. But first, let's take a look at the pub's prior incarnation, even before that, when it was known as the Queen's Head. Here's a newspaper mention of 1758 with a good match for the location. adjoining to Gray's Inn Gate. I couldn't find any written records of the Queen's Head prior to the 1750s though. There is an oft quoted claim that there has been a pub on this site going all the way back to 1430, but I've seen no written proof of that. If that is indeed true, then that would suggest that one of these buildings on the Agas map of around the 1560s would in fact be some forerunner of the City of Yorke. This gap between the gardens here seems like a likely candidate for what became the southern entrance to Gray's Inn, so that might imply one of these buildings here is the Queen's Head, or whatever it was called at that point in history. It seems the premises were first taken on by George Hennicky in 1831 and then named the Gray's Inn Wine and possibly Spirit Establishment. A very detailed advert here lists the wines and spirits on offer at that time, including such intriguing beverages as Very Curious Old Port brackets beeswing. Here's a relatively early advert for sherry from 1834, and you can see that at that time they were selling sherry in butts, hogsheads and quarter casks, so the current display of those in the back bar is actually quite appropriate. There's even a sketch of the cellars here in an advert of 1834, and it's tempting to think that the cellars, which are still here today, may have been retained in that rebuild of the 1920s. Here's an article about that rebuild in 1923, by which time the pub was known as Hennicky's Wine Bar, and this is presumably the explanation for those letter H's in the gables on the front of the building. There's a mention here that the previous building had dated back about 2 centuries, and then talk of an old lantern which purportedly used to illuminate the cellars in Stuart times. By 1934, Hennicky's had expanded to 17 branches, and actually several of these ended up being Sam Smith's pubs. The head office here on High Holborn, now known as the City of Yorke, number 354 on the Strand, now the Lyceum Tavern, and 14 Kingley Street, which we know today as the Red Lion. I've featured all of those in previous videos. The Hennicky's name was still in use here in 1980, just a few years prior to it becoming the City of Yorke. As noted, this is probably my favourite Sam Smith's pub of all in London, partly because this was the pub responsible for kindling a kind of love affair with London pubs. I saw a picture of it in a 1960s, 1970s publication called, I think, The Food of the British Isles, from Time Life maybe. It had a photo of this magnificent back bar, and I was just enchanted on seeing that. I thought that looks incredible. I don't think I quite realised at the time that it was mock Tudor of the 1920s rather than something genuinely ancient, but I love it nonetheless, even if it is only 100 years old. I have again gone for a pint of Old Brewery Bitter, put the price there on screen. Number 3 on today's itinerary, and another one with the maximal 3-star rating from camera for its historic pub interior, the Princess Louise in Holborn. Cheers from the Princess Louise. This is the third in that run of Sam Smith's pubs that get that maximal 3-star rating from camera for their historic pub interiors. And this one is an example of magnificent late Victorian pub interior design. It is another pub I have covered before in a previous video. As always, I'll put the links down below in the description. So I'm not going to repeat myself too much here, but I do think it's worth a revisit because this interior is so spectacular. Although this pub was built in 1872, a year after its eponymous member of the royal family, Princess Louise, was married to the Duke of Argyll, the interior that we see today mostly dates from 1891, when there was a major refit. It's important to note that some parts of it have had to be reinstated, possibly in the 1960s, which was that famous nadir for pub interiors. The partitions, the screens were removed, but thankfully they were reinstated by Sam Smith's in the early 21st century. However, many of the other fixtures and fittings inside this pub are still original from that 1890s refit, including these magnificent mirrors along the outer walls with intricate etched glass. The tiling, which is perhaps best appreciated in the corridors that run either side of the pub and in the two entrance vestibules. Also terrazzo flooring, mosaic tiling in both of those corridors and in both of those entrance vestibules. And the bar counter and the bar back, I believe, is also original according to camera's notes. There is a clock, 4 faces to that, in the middle of the bar back fixture. That could possibly date back to the late Victorian era as well. Quite unusual to have an original clock still in place in a pub. Another point of note here at the Princess Louise is the collection of stained glass windows, believed to be from the 1890s. There are, I think, at least 3 on display currently. One here that says painting, 2 upstairs that say music and drama. Did I read possibly somewhere there was a 4th which may have been lost? And I think Sam Smiths have done an absolutely fantastic job here of recreating the late Victorian atmosphere. Is it 7, 8 distinct spaces within the pub as a result of the reinstating of those partitions? As with all Sam Smith's pubs, the lack of piped music and other trappings of modernity like fruit machines mean this is one of the most faithful recreations of what the atmosphere would have been like in a late Victorian pub, and I think that makes this a particularly magical space. I wanted a break from the Old Brewery bitter, so I've gone for Sam Smith Stout. I think Sam Smith's happened to do a particularly good stout. A little bit of a shame that it's on the keg taps rather than on the hand pulls. I know I'm repeating myself from a previous video, but this is a very unusual example of a pub where the gents' toilets are actually described in the historic England listing for the building. Magnificent late Victorian urinals there. Pub number 4 on today's itinerary, and to my surprise, I don't actually think I've been here before. This is the Angel in St Giles, which when I was doing the research for this video, I found is surprisingly ancient. It is also on camera's list of historic pub interiors, this one getting a 2-star rating. Cheers from the Angel in St Giles. This pub has a surprisingly long history, which particularly in its early years was very much connected to the neighbouring St Giles Church. St Giles was once a hamlet in its own right, located between the cities of London and Westminster in open fields, and was the site of a monastery and a leper hospital founded by good Queen Maud, the wife of Henry I, in the 12th century. The Angel sits on land which would have been owned by the monastery, and there is a long tradition of inns attached to monastic settlements. In fact, the Angel may have even been depicted on the roughly 1560s Agas map. It's sometimes referred to as being one of the Spittal houses, one of the houses devoted to providing accommodation to travellers and all the poor and needy. Some sources suggest that the Angel would likely have been the westernmost of this run of houses. Some sources cite the earliest written reference to the Angel here as being 1546, and the earliest mention I found was in 1674 in the London Gazette, an advert trying to trace some stolen horses. It's also labelled on William Morgan's map of 1682. You can see a number here, 88, next to St Giles Church, and if you look in the legend, that is labelled in wonderfully oldie worldy letters as the Angel Inn. So at an absolute minimum, there has been a pub on this site called the Angel going back 350 years. In 1773, the pub is mentioned in an account of a man who apparently walked from here to York and back in the space of 6 days. That's nearly 400 miles as a round trip, and I think he would have had to have averaged about 2 3/4 miles an hour, even without any rests whatsoever, to achieve that. Seems a little bit far-fetched to me. Moving forward to the 1880s, on Goad's map of 1887, we can see the outline of the building marked with a PH for public house, and also the carriageway, a remnant of the time that this used to be something like a coaching inn, was depicted there. The current building is a rebuild of the 1890s, but it has apparently retained much of the footprint of the earlier building of the Angel, including particularly this carriageway, that relic of the time that this was likely something like a coach coaching in. As noted, this is on camera's list of historic pub interiors, and it's one of only 2 Sam Smith's pubs in London that get a 2-star rating. We've already seen all 3 of the ones that get the 3-star rating. That carriageway mentioned earlier is actually one of the most notable features of the pub. It's covered on almost all sides with tiling on the walls. There are brown tiles at the foot level, greenish tiles towards the dado level, yellowy, orangey, possibly slightly cream coloured tiles from there up, and these panels on one side. One of those panels also contains a sign pointing to the saloon bar, second door, and on the other side of that carriageway there are what camera describes as screens. To me they look like windows with some original, apparently, etched glass from the 1890s. The inside space proper is very much in 2 distinct halves. The original bar room has at least some fittings from the 1890s, that's a more Victorian space, and then there is a second bar room that is likely an addition of something like the 1930s, and that does appear to have a more 1930s style bar counter. There is a quite ornate plasterwork ceiling in that first bar room, which is not mentioned in camera's listing for the interior, so possibly that's a later addition. But it does seem the bar counter in that original bar room of the late Victorian period is original, even if the bar back is a later addition. There's also a small snug, which I think is possibly what that hand sign saying saloon bar is pointing to. Looking quickly at the outside of the building, there is some granite that could be lavakite on the frontage there. However, towards the top of those pillars, there's some embellishment that is gilded that has more of a kind of Art Deco feel to it to me. So I wonder if that was more of a 1930s addition. There's also some nice etched and frosted glass in the windows there, including 2 windows that have the name of the pub, the Angel, spelled out in blue lettering. That to me looks a bit more 1930s as well. I'm having a half of Sam Smith's Old Brewery Bitter here. I'll put the price on screen. I'm really quite taken with the Angel here in St Giles. Somehow this had just fallen between the cracks for me. As I said, it does sit between the City of London, the City of Westminster, and just beyond the bounds of Holborn, which is an old stomping ground of mine. I haven't really explored the pubs in this immediate area of St Giles that much in the past. But this has a surprisingly long history, quite possibly 500 years old, if not at an absolute minimum 350 years old, with really good written records to attest to that. And also it's worth adding that not many of these central London Sam Smith's pubs have a lot of outside drinking space. So this has this converted former stable yard, the testament to the fact that this was a one-time coaching inn, or an inn at least of sorts, and that carriageway, which makes another bit of great outdoor space, semi-outdoor space, covered when it rains as well. I struggled a bit with what to choose for 5th place on this list. I think if we were going purely by the camera list of historic pub interiors, 5th place should belong to the George and Vulture. It's the only other one of those 2 pubs in London from Sam Smith's that has a 2-star rating. Functions a bit more as a restaurant today, so I'm not sure if that really, I don't know, it's sort of a pub, sort of isn't. But there are also several pubs here in Fitzrovia, which is where I find myself now, that are operated by Sam Smith's, most famous of course being the Fitzroy Tavern. I have featured that before in a video on Fitzrovia pubs, obviously, and there is also the Champion back there, which is another fine pub. Both of those have accolades from camera for their outstanding conversions or renovations for their interiors, but they're not on the list of genuine historic pub interiors. Very hard for me to pick that pub that occupies 5th place. I think if I was going purely on personal preference, I would probably go for the Angel in Rotherhithe, which is a particular favourite of mine, but again, that is in the wrong part of London now. So why don't we go and look at a pub that I haven't featured before in any of these videos, the Cock Tavern. Cheers from the Cock Tavern. The current building, like the Angel, dates to the 1890s, and this is a style familiar from that late Victorian or early Edwardian period. Red brick, white stone dressings, a 3-storey Tyrrell and a couple of gables. Some nice detailing on the upper floors, including this frieze between the 1st and 2nd floors, a panel with the name and the sign of the pub. Beneath a shell niche, and another panel with the date of the rebuild, 1897. Some huge lanterns, probably a more modern addition. The ground floor frontage is covered in a pinkish granite, possibly Swedish, possibly from Aberdeenshire. Inside, although this doesn't make it onto CAMRA's list of historic pub interiors, it is, however, on their list of outstanding conversions and renovations, and there are actually notes there that at least some of the features are original from that late Victorian rebuild. The bar back is apparently original. It's a 3-bay arcade housing these etch mirrors with carved wooden pediments atop each one, and that's a motif which has been copied in some of the newer woodwork. You can see those pediments with their fanned interiors recreated in some of the partitions, which have been added back in the Sam Smith's era, but almost certainly there would have been partitions in this space in the pub's original Victorian design. This example also has a clock atop it. This recreation of a snob screen is presumably a newer addition as well, and sits slightly incongruously across a small section of the middle of the bar counter. Some of the panelling is also apparently original, as is the fire surround here. Not sure about the overmantel, but that features more appealing carved wood, and another repetition of that fan or shell motif seen in various places around the pub. It really is quite a handsome pub interior, I think. The pub predates that late Victorian rebuild, at least back to the first half of the 1800s. Here's a newspaper mention of it from 1834, an account of a savage assault which took place here. So there we have it, the top 5-ish, or at least a solid top 4. It's always very hard to create these top X in Y lists, always very open to debate, very contentious, but I do think at least those first 3 surely belong in, if not everyone's top 5 Sam Smith pubs in London, then surely the top 10. They really are the crown jewels of Sam Smith's London pub portfolio. No doubt some people will feel compelled in the comments to register their sentiments one way or the other about Sam Smith's as a brewer and as a pub operator. As I said at the start, I think I'm overall a fan, despite some of the negative press that they seem to garner, because they do maintain this incredibly traditional pub atmosphere. These are some of the pubs in London where it's easiest to sort of squint your eyes and imagine you are living in an earlier period of history. So here from the Cock Tavern in Fitzrovia, I think that's going to be it for this video. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Cheers. A quick addendum here. As of the making of this video, I've now featured 20 of the 36 Sam Smith's pubs in London, and I've put together this playlist of all those videos, which you can hopefully see linked on screen now. There's also a link to that in the description. Most of my videos have chapter markers in them, so it should be easy to skip ahead to the part about an individual pub. Once again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.